Hey, welcome to our second Life Plus installment for the 22 school year. Today we're going to talk about understanding the times and how that relates back to what we talked about last time with truth and the importance of knowing truth. And I'm going to start by reading a verse in Judges. This comes from Judges chapter 2, and it says, "The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things that the Lord had done for Israel." And then skipping down to verse 10, it says, "After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel." And then in the very last verse of Judges says, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit." And what we see in Judges is a dark time in Israel where the generation before them had seen God rescue them from slavery in Egypt, and then he had taken care of them for 40 years in the wilderness, and then he had led them into the promised land, conquered the promised land, given them the land that he had promised way back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So Israel knew of these great fathers. They knew that the Lord had provided for them. The Lord had made them into a great nation. The Lord had given them this land. But now they chose to not follow him anymore. And it says that the elders that knew Israel had died, and they didn't leave a legacy behind. And what resulted is people just did turn to their evil ways, and they fell into sin, and they were full of corruption, and everyone just did whatever they see fit, which reminds me a lot of America today and our culture today, where people believe their own truth. They do what they want to do. What's right for you may not be right for me, but I can't judge you, and I can't tell you what's right for you. It's all about opinions. It's all about feelings. But also during that same time in the Bible, you read the book of Ruth, and Ruth takes time during the time of the Judges. And in Ruth, you see a Moabite woman who was married to an Israelite, and when her husband died, instead of returning to her Moabite ancestry and family, she chose to stay faithful and to stay with Naomi, her mother-in-law. And in Ruth 1:16, it says, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Where your people will be my people, and your God will be my God.'" And what we see is a life that was transformed by God. We see that Ruth learned about the God of Israel and knew him to be the true God, and she didn't want to abandon that. She didn't want to abandon her mother-in-law. She stayed true. She went with Naomi back to Israel and trusted God to provide, and he did. He led her to Boaz. Boaz looked after her. They got married, and she ended up being in the line of Jesus. And so God blessed her for her faithfulness, and we see Ruth being a light in dark times. And so Doug, why don't you tell us how that applies to us today?
Yeah, so I think when you look at that picture in Scripture of darkness and people rebelling and going after their own desires, contrasted with a light of a one person making a choice to believe truth and to hold on to it. It's the equivalent of, if you can picture right now, walking into a room and turning every light out, closing every window, and it's pitch black to the point where you're in that darkness where you literally can't see anything. And if you light one candle in the middle of that room, it's amazing how that one candle, as that time goes on, gives light to the entire room and enables you to see clearly. And it's the same thing with Ruth then. It's the same thing with Christians today. We live in a time period, going back to our last installment, where we don't hold on to truth, where everybody creates their own truth. And the problem with that is it's not true. It's not true truth, as Jesus would say in Scripture. It becomes an opinion-oriented society that's based on my emotions and my feelings. And what Ruth does, and I love basically combination of, she in her heart and her emotions is faithful to her mother-in-law and continues to follow. But she does that because of the truth that's been built in her mind about who God truly is. And so for us today, the reason we want to put this in front of all of us is to ask the question, going back to the beginning of Judges, why did they fall away? It's because they weren't taking the truth that they had seen, the realities about God, the faithfulness of God, the stories of God, and teaching them to their children. And when that next generation came up, they abandoned it because they didn't know it. And so my question for you, and our question that we talk about, is, are we teaching the truths of God to our children on a daily basis? Are we pointing them to Christ on a daily basis? Are we taking time to talk about, where have you seen God be faithful on a daily basis? Are we praying together as a family on a daily basis? And the reason those things are so incredibly critical is, one, for all of us right now, it reminds us, it recenters our mind on what is true. and it takes our thinking back to what is true and what is reality. But two, it also begins to instill those values and those realities into the minds and the hearts of our children. And it's something that so often we talk about as Christians, but we're not always great at putting into practice. And my prayer for all of us, I know Neely and I's heart for this is that as we talk, we would all walk through this journey together as a community, but we would be taking time to be intentional with our kids so that their minds are set on truth. Because I will guarantee you this, their minds are hearing all sorts of things that are not true on a daily basis, whether it be through the media, through their phones, through their friends, through whatever's going on around them. And if they don't have a reality to ground them in truth, to anchor them back to the truth of Christ, they will quickly be led astray, just like the people of the Judges. But if they have that reality, they will have the ability to stand firm, just like Ruth. And that's our desire for all of us. Thank y'all so much for your partnership, and I pray that this is helpful as we continue to grow together as a community.